Freud's methodology, as improved upon over the past 100 years, allows us access to our minds in a unique and life-enhancing manner. It allows us to learn how what we take to be adult rational thinking is in fact infused with childhood imaginings, fears, hopes, and desires. This was recently brought to my attention in a dramatic Proust-like fashion when I began eating a sweetened yogurt product mixed with bananas. Suddenly, in what we've all experienced, I was back in my childhood kitchen, surrounded, in fact enveloped with sensations, smell, and the warmth of maternal love. I was retasting the sour cream, sugar, and bananas that my mother prepared for me. I was re-experiencing an idealized moment of my young life. This moment has been inside me all of the time. The current day yogurt tasting and a host of other circumstances evoked the sensuality of that precious memory. It is, of course, not only sweetnesses from our past that remain inside us, ready to emerge when least expected. We also contain an internal unconscious catalog of hurts, neglects, and frustrations that are also ready to emerge at times of their own choosing. Those childhood pains, when evoked by current-day circumstances, are also linked to childhood versions of revenge, which brings us to today's topic of forgiveness. Forgiveness, or not, is like all such affectively alive experiences, inexorably linked to our childhood ways of thinking and remembering. It's important to note that in spite of the richness of my bananas and sugar relived memory, it is far from an accurate rendering of that early experience. My mother, like all mothers, was many things, only one of which was sweet. Also, sour cream is far from a health-promoting snack for a young child, and to tell you the truth, I didn't even like it so much. My point is that the truth of that moment is barely represented in this recovered memory. So too for the many hurts and neglects we have inside us. Alive in us, sure. Literally accurate, not so much. For some, the recovery of childhood hurts is an essential aspect of their psychoanalysis. Many have lived lives unknowingly twisted by the need to not remember. Often their bodies remember through multiple intractable pains. For others who don't seemingly remember, it falls on those intimates around them to suffer the slings from the original hurts. We find this to be a complicated and quite human story. Hurts that are not recalled, hurts that are recalled with vagary, hurts that are often collected as a hobby, that hide other hurts. So when we face the issue of hurts, which leads us to the issue of revenge, which leads us to the consideration of forgiveness, we are faced with a challenging task. What part of today's bitternesses relate to this adult moment, and in what manner are they being colored by childhood perceptions, misperceptions? In a functioning psychoanalysis, one of the tasks is to recall as vividly as possible, to relive in the moment with the analyst, and to reconsider with the perspective of adult wisdom. This goes for hurts, revenge, and of course, forgiveness. The forgiveness at issue, about which we will learn a great deal more today, is not of the simple behavioral sort, nor does it involve masochistic submission, turning of the other cheek, or reaction formation. It is not anything that invalidates responsibility, and it is something that can be both sought after as well as granted. This forgiveness is a capacity to be free from an addiction to negativity, to be able to mentalize, to mourn, and ultimately to discover the restorative love in one's own life, a love that needn't extend to the perpetrators of the hurt. Martin Bergman, a well-known analyst, offered his own summary of the subject. He said, quote, "Every attitude we have is a mixture of aggression and love, including the relationship of our superego, our conscience, to our ego. If for whatever reason, prayer or psychoanalytic work, a shift has taken place in favor of love, the subjective feeling of this shift will be experienced as forgiveness." We have all read movie reviews. about movies often set in Manhattan, often of a small, well-heeled group of individuals. And the review says something like, well, the characters are well drawn, the acting was nuanced, the plot moved along, but there was something missing in the movie. There was something about the breadth of the human experience that wasn't represented in this movie. Frankly, I think the same could be said about my comments that I just said. They didn't reflect sufficiently, for me, the breadth of the human experience. And if we're going to take up the subject of forgiveness seriously, as we are here to do today, I don't think we can take up the subject without including in our consideration the full ugliness of the human experience. And unfortunately, in all of our lifetimes, we have seen more than our fair share of uglinesses. For example, in the 1940s, the architects of the death camps celebrated their ability to murder hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, innocents all, in as efficient a manner as they did. This is something different. Forgiveness? You know, that we hear a lot of cliches about the subject. One that we all know about is one says that we could forgive but not forget. Often we see in our offices the clinical situation where someone has forgotten but not forgiven. And then there are those who have been through the camps and have simply concluded the subject by saying, forgiveness died at Auschwitz. For example, in 2001, there were large numbers of people who danced in the streets when they learned about the murder of the 3,000 innocents in our World Trade Center. They danced in the streets. This is something different. Forgiveness? You know, we analysts, like any profession, use jargon to describe complicated states of mind. And we have a phrase that's called the paranoid schizoid position. It's a phrase to represent a certain mindset, perhaps of individuals as well as cultures. And in that mindset, all goodness is seen as belonging to the individual, and all badness is seen as belonging to the other. As a result of which, empathy with the other's experience is neither valued nor desired. The capacity to mentalize, to use metaphor, is neither valued nor desired. The ability to mourn, to recognize ambivalence towards others, is neither valued nor desired. Now, alternatively, there is a mindset that's called the depressive reparative position. And this mindset, which is more characteristic of people who put on and attend lectures on forgiveness, is characterized by an interest in the experience of the other, a valuing of the ability to symbolize trauma and affects, and a capacity to engage and learn from reasonable amounts of guilt, the operative word being reasonable. The problem over the subject of forgiveness is that when you try to have a conversation with someone and you don't recognize that they are in the other mindset, what occurs from that attempted conversation is less the hoped for shared understanding and instead more misunderstanding. For example, in 2014, there were adults who handed out candy to children to teach them to celebrate the murder of other children. This is something different. Forgiveness? You know, we all know and have had the experience that to forgive is to the benefit of the forgiver, and we know what that feels like and what that means. A question I have is, if those who are in a position to be forgiven don't seek forgiveness, don't value forgiveness, and don't even know that they are in desperate need of forgiveness, does the consideration of forgiveness for them benefit the forgiver or coarsen the forgiver? Well, I'm pleased to say that for these and other simple and straightforward questions, we have today with us a scholar, Professor Stephen Frosh, who is an academic associate from the British Psychoanalytic Society and a founder and professor of the Psychosocial Studies program at Birkbeck College, the University of London, where he's also the Pro-Vice Master for Research. Now, I first met Professor Frosh, met in quotes, when I came upon and read this book of his. It's called Hate and the Jewish Science, Anti-Semitism, Nazism, and Psychoanalysis. It's a masterpiece. It is a thoughtful psychoanalytic study of anti-Semitism, as well as a thoughtful study of the effect of anti-Semitism on the development of psychoanalysis. Now, I assume many of you are like me, that when you come upon an author who not only writes beautifully, but thinks beautifully, you want to read more of what he's written. Well, let me warn you, that's a deep pond to jump in when it comes to Stephen Frosh. He is quite a prolific writer. Let me just give you the titles of a sampling of his books. This is a sampling. One is called A Brief Introduction to Psychoanalytic Theory. One is called For and Against Psychoanalysis. Then there's Psychoanalysis Outside the Clinic. There's a short but very wise book called Feelings. The Politics of Psychoanalysis, an Introduction to Freudian and Post-Freudian Theory. And his latest publication called Hauntings, Psychoanalysis and Ghostly Transmissions. Those are just his books. His many, many, many articles, again, just a taste of the subject matter he writes about. Postmodernism versus psychotherapy. Issues for men working with sexually abused children. Psychoanalysis, colonialism, and racism. Lacanian psychoanalysis. Young masculinities and sexual abuse. Freud and Jewish dreaming. Freud and Jewish identity. Facing Political Truths, Psychotherapy and Politics. Those are some of his journal writings. Now, as the proverbial saying goes, in his spare time, he is also an administrator and a teacher. His overall subject of interest is social identities, and specifically in what psychoanalysis can offer when it is applied outside the clinic. He teaches a course at Birkbeck College on psychoanalysis and culture. He teaches a course on love. He's running a research project on ethical monotheism. And in addition to having raised 3 sons, he is also the chair of his local Orthodox synagogue. Stephen, if you'll forgive my holiday plagiarism, if he had just been a prolific writer, that would have been enough. If he had just been a gifted teacher, that would have been enough. But I've had the pleasure of spending a good deal of time with Stephen this weekend, and above and beyond those quite significant accomplishments, he is a warm, delightful, and very thoughtful man. With great pleasure, Professor Stephen Frosh.
Thank you, Harvey, for that over-the-top introduction, and also for the beautiful opening to your presentation then, and the impossible questions that you've just asked. I do want to actually start formally by thanking Harvey for organising this and for his incredible generosity and hospitality over the course of this weekend, and also to my hosts, Ruth Garfield and Larry Deutsch, who've been putting me up and gave me a beautiful Shabbat yesterday. Thank you ever so much for your warmth. I'm going to speak about this intersection between forgiveness in Judaism and in psychoanalysis. And it's a complicated topic, and one that I found myself writing out, so I'll read a paper. I hope it's quite accessible. There's my one single joke today, as far as I know, is about what happens if you fall asleep If you fall asleep while I'm speaking, that's fine. But it is a psychoanalytic encounter, this. So if you wake up, you have to tell your dreams, right? You have to tell your dreams. The other thing to say about that is that it's a slightly elliptical paper in 4 parts. And that's because of a phrase I heard a couple of years ago that has really stuck in my mind, which is that the space of truth is curved. The space of truth is curved. When you try and go directly at something, you miss it. That's actually why psychoanalysis goes on for so long. That's why you need to talk and go over and over and over and come back and try again and keep going at it and make mistakes and try again. The space of truth is curved. It's no good thinking that you can just name the thing and you'll have done with it. You have to somehow get at it from all sorts of different directions. And that's what I'm going to try and do. I've tried to keep any technical vocabulary, either of Jewish or of psychoanalytic thought, to a minimum. So I apologize, firstly, where I don't manage that, and therefore you might, at the end, if you want, ask questions that clarify things. And I also want to apologize to those of you for whom some of this will feel perhaps elementary as I explain my terms, but I have been told and recognize that this is a broad audience, and I want to try and respect everybody in it. So, thank you very much for having me. This talk is called Forgiveness in Judaism and Psychoanalysis, and the first part is called simply Miriam. At the end of the biblical portion called Behalotecha, which is in the book of Numbers, Miriam is punished with leprosy for her leading part in speaking ill of her brother Moses' marriage to the Cushite Zipporah. Her other brother, Aaron, pleads with Moses to intervene. And Moses indeed prays to God in 5 Hebrew words of great simplicity. El na refanala. God, please heal her. This is a deeply poignant moment. The hurt that Miriam has caused is set aside. The directness of Moses' appeal to God reveals its heartfelt nature. Forgive her, heal her. Don't let the damage she has done prove irrevocable. God responds that Miriam must live outside the camp for 7 days, and after that can re-enter, enforcing a ritual of exclusion and re-acceptance, of marking the sin and then letting it go. It's notable here that there is a tone more of sorrow over how Miriam has let herself down than of recrimination. The misdeed and the hurt that she has caused have to be acknowledged and cannot simply be ignored. Nevertheless, there is a way back into the community. Judaism is not always as forgiving as this, but in theory at least it promotes a philosophy and practice of reconciliation that is founded on acknowledgement of the reality of hurt and of the importance of mechanisms of reparation. There is a Kabbalistic myth that I'll come back to a couple of times in this talk, that at the moment of creation, God had made a set of vessels to contain his essence, but that most of them shattered, scattering the light of divinity throughout the universe. As I say, I'll return to this myth later, but it suggests that the flaw in creation cannot be wished away. Damage will often be done, however carefully we might try to avoid it. There is a kind of death drive in operation, whether or not it's identical to the one Freud invented. Something that not only expresses intentional violence, but also simply trips us up when we think we have managed to stay level. But precisely because of this, Judaism recognizes that we need ritualizing remedies and that these must be allowed to set matters to rest. All those sin offerings, for example, described in minute detail in what for most of us are the dullest bits of the Torah, testify to the importance of practices that will unbind the sinners from their sins and bind them back into the community. This week's Torah portion that we read yesterday, with its focus on tsarat, that is, an illness that's not exactly leprosy, but a kind of perniciousness that affects people and houses, resulting in elaborate purifying rituals before the affliction can be regarded as removed. And most strikingly of all, the possibility of being released from wrongdoing is emphasized in the ritual of the scapegoat, which we read every Yom Kippur, in which the high priest recants his own sins, those of his family, and those of the community, sins which are sent wandering out into the wilderness on the back of a luckless goat, so that it is the wrongdoings that are cast out, and not the doer of them. Notably, all these examples have much to do with speech, Miriam's slander, the traditional association between Sara'at and Lashon Hora, speaking ill of people, and the link between the ritual of the scapegoat and its replacement by the symbolic acts of Yom Kippur, when we list our wrongdoings individually and collectively and ask each other for forgiveness. Maybe even the sequence of Torah portions read in the synagogue in the next 3 weeks is relevant here. Achremot, Kedoshim, Emor, translated as after death, holiness, spoken, or more familiarly, speak well of those who are not able to speak for themselves. Language, what is nowadays being called injurious speech, is of central significance in hurtfulness and damage, and also in remediating it. The contemporary commentator Aviva Zornberg notes the grammatically fanciful but homiletically convergent sources of midbar, wilderness, and davar, to speak. It is through words that we are driven into the wilderness, and perhaps through words, the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, which are above our ark here, perhaps through words that we find our way out. We already have a lot to think about here. What kinds of actions demand forgiveness, and what kind can be forgiven? What is the place of ritual in this? And to what degree does it depend on an inner sorrowing and acknowledgement of having done wrong? Most of all, perhaps, are there conditions under which forgiveness makes no sense at all, in which the wrongdoer can never expunge the destructive act? The kind of questions that Harvey was just raising. And to be specific about our topic today, given the claim made by this lecture series that psychoanalysis is immersed in Jewish thought, can psychoanalysis be viewed as a modern ritualizing remedy? If so, who or what is being held responsible for the damage we do to ourselves and others, and who should be forgiven? One thing to note about the biblical episode with which I began is that it is the victim, Moses, who appeals for forgiveness for the perpetrator, if we can use that term, Miriam. His love for her, this sister who watched over him in his earliest period of life, and in whose merit the Israelites have been kept watered throughout their travels in the desert, triumphs over any feelings he might have of being betrayed. El na Rafana la, God please heal her. In addition, something not accidental to my own interests and arguments, the hurt is over a moment of racism and repudiation of difference. Moses had married a Cushite, perhaps an Ethiopian, a black woman. The most important classical commentator on the Bible, the 11th century commentator Rashi, suggests that there is a link between the terms Cushite and woman of beauty, both Hebrew words having the same numerical value. However one reads this, Rashi says about Moses' wife, everyone agreed she was beautiful, just as everyone agrees a Cushite is black. It suggests the operation of envy as the source of slander. Something pernicious and modern operates here, with which we are all too familiar, the denigration in words and deeds of racialized others. If there is a lesson, though of course this is not a sermon, it is that if we are truly to be able to seek forgiveness and reconciliation wherever there is conflict, we need to acknowledge how racism and disparagement of others can even creep into Jewish sensibilities. Moses, the greatest prophet in Judaism, whom the Lord knew face to face, as it says, married a black woman, and his family was punished by God when they complained. But let's get back to the main point. What counts here is that forgiveness comes from Moses and then from God. The one who has been wronged is the only one who can decide to forgive and who can ask for the punishment meted out to the wrongdoer to be ameliorated. There is a Jewish principle at work here, at least in cases of human-to-human wrongdoing. One has to forgive a perpetrator who asks genuinely for forgiveness. This genuineness includes full acknowledgement of what was done. But what can this mean, psychoanalytically speaking, and what is it we can forgive? My second part is called An Uncomfortable History. My own perspective on psychoanalysis is not primarily a clinical one, though I have great respect for and some experience of its clinical practice. I have no doubt that at the level of this practice, it might be possible for a patient who has been hurt, or feels her or himself to have been hurt, to find ways to be released from evisceration by an inability to move on from that hurt, which may or may not involve forgiveness. I tend to think of one part of the process of psychoanalysis as a kind of unbinding, which itself has a biblical resonance. In this instance, if we are bound to those who have injured us and to those who we have injured through a situation of continuing irresolution, then perhaps one thing psychoanalysis might offer is a route to some freedom from this binding through seeking or giving forgiveness. It might also be relevant to consider the moments in which the analyst seeks a kind of forgiveness from the patient. The American psychoanalyst Jessica Benjamin has theorized this in detail with her notion of the moral third, which she defines as the courage for the non-judgmental awareness that honestly recognizes moments of dissociation, misattunement, defensiveness. That is to say, analysts might have to take responsibility for their missteps and not interpret everything as a reflection of the patient's unconscious state of mind. This clinical notion is also used by Benjamin to think about issues of responsibility in the political field, somewhere outside the clinic. Put simply, the analyst will not have caused the patient's original injury. But however skilled she or he is, there will be moments of injuriousness in which, as Benjamin puts it, the analyst bumps into the patient's bruise. The clinical responsibility to note and acknowledge this becomes an ethical responsibility to respond to the bruising of the other, that a witness, that is, one who has not initiated the original injury, a witness participates in through associating with oppression or through failing to take up an active stance against it. This happens in every time and place in which we are called on to take a stand, to become the moral third, yet are tempted to shy away from this call. Thinking about psychoanalysis as an institutional and political practice, however, there are a number of complexities to deal with. I see psychoanalysis as a critical discipline in its essence, by which I mean that it raises a lens to individuals and to society that challenges them to think honestly. In the name of a kind of truth, however slippery that concept might be, it demands that people do not deceive themselves, and it refuses to take at face value the claims that are made about them. Despite this, psychoanalysis has not always found it easy to face up to its own historical truths. I want to spend a few minutes on this, focusing on one episode of clear relevance to the issue of Jewishness and psychoanalysis, not as an attack on psychoanalysis, but rather as an object lesson in how hard it is to get to that stage of asking forgiveness that I mentioned before. In order to be an ethical practice, which is how I see psychoanalysis, there is often some darkness that has to be faced. And psychoanalysis as an institution, which is not a statement about individual psychoanalysts, many of whom have been very brave in sometimes dangerous circumstances, psychoanalysis as an institution has not always been so good at holding up a torch. My example here comes from something I worked on in the book that Harvey mentioned, Hate and the Jewish Science, the attempt by the International Psychoanalytic Association to find a way of dealing with the legacy of the actions of the German psychoanalysts in the period of the Third Reich. One focal moment for this was at the IPA, that's the International Psychoanalytic Association, the IPA Congress in Hamburg in 1985, which I shall briefly describe. Another was in the Berlin Congress of 2007, which I've written about subsequently and will return to equally briefly in a moment. There are now many places in which the history of German psychoanalysis engagement with Nazism is dealt with in detail. This work has shown clearly that the psychoanalysts followed a policy of appeasement towards the Nazis, characterized by an attempt to distance psychoanalysis from its Jewish elements. That this resulted very quickly in the cleansing from the German Psychoanalytical Society of its Jewish members, and that the non-Jewish analysts who thereafter constituted the society maintained their activities throughout the period of the Third Reich, mostly in congruence with the regime. For many years, this history was largely hidden as the psychoanalysts set about rebuilding their organization and their myths, presenting themselves, like many other Germans, as always having been victims and possibly opponents of Nazism. It was only at the first post-war Congress to take place in Germany, the Hamburg Congress of 1985, that the real history broke into consciousness. More than anything else, this was through an accompanying exhibition which revealed to the psychoanalysts in an undeniable way, through documents and photographs, as well as an understated commentary, simply how far the collaboration with the Nazis had gone, and how impossible it would be to see this as anything other than a betrayal of the Jewish analysts and of psychoanalysis itself. It is this heritage with which the returnees to Germany for the two congresses had to contend. Not everything that goes on in congresses relates closely to the main event. People have their personal and professional agendas and interests, and many of the papers that are given there could be given anywhere in the world. This was no less true of the Hamburg and Berlin IPA congresses than of any other, but it's nevertheless the case that everything that happened in both places seems to have happened under the shadow of the return to Germany, and could not escape the issue of what it means to have a Nazi past. In this regard, the Hamburg Congress got off to a good start. The Congress was opened by the mayor of Hamburg, Klaus von Dohnanyi, a remarkable man, and he gave a well-informed and direct presentation of the issues and feelings that were involved in holding the Congress on German soil. Von Dohnanyi noted that the exhibition had revealed the equivalence between the actions of psychoanalysts during the Third Reich and those of other Germans, even those who might seem well-intentioned. For fear of losing everything, he said, bit by bit was sacrificed, every step being rational, and yet at the same time always in the wrong direction. Here a compromise concerning persons, there a compromise of principles, but always in the pretended interest of preserving the whole, which in the end was lost. Von Dohnanyi then asked whether psychoanalysis could help us not only to understand ourselves better, but also to be and act better. His doubts on this subject were clear for all to see. And finally, looking the issue of acknowledging the past through identification straight in the face, he said, "Whoever says our Bach and our Beethoven must also say our Hitler. This too will be one of your topics." Actually, it was not. Instead, one could see at work in the Congress clear instances of what psychoanalysis itself recognizes as denial. There was praise for the achievements of the German Psychoanalytical Association, which was formed in 1950 as a way of regaining acceptance by the IPA, but which itself contained collaborators. And there was an account of psychoanalysis as one of the victims of Nazism, but there was little that examined the German psychoanalyst culpability. There were references later to the power of the emotional atmosphere of the Congress, and claims that the effect of this was that by its end, our German colleagues were not only colleagues, but very often friends, to quote, as if reconciliation and forgiveness had been wrought. However, it's clear from the accounts of others present that not everyone agreed. Raphael Moses and Rina Ryszowski-Moses, two Israeli analysts, spoke on behalf of many Jewish analysts when they expressed their unease and disappointment. "We left Hamburg before the official farewell party," they wrote. "We were feeling vaguely depressed. The general atmosphere was that something had been missed. The central issue of this Congress, that it was the first one to be held in Germany since the Second World War and since the Holocaust, had been very much in the air, but had not been adequately dealt with." They go on to describe a sequence of events during the Congress in which both German and non-German, including Jewish analysts, step back from confronting the feelings swirling below the surface, as if they did not want to risk blowing something fragile apart. In what might perhaps be seen as a common defensive move, the past was invoked precisely in order that it should not be fully faced. That is, sometimes a way of not dealing with something is to talk about it as if it has already been resolved. We should move on can be a powerful defensive move. Moses and Rashofsky Moses suggest that behind all this there was a complex of dynamics, including particularly a fear on the part of German analysts that they were going to be attacked, so that they and the organizers of the Congress worked hard to avoid confrontations, and a complementary sense amongst non-German analysts that they wanted to move on, that the Germans of today, another quote here, could not and should not be held responsible for what their parent generation had done, that peace must be made and the past put aside. The concern then became that the Congress should go well rather than deal with the issues, the kind of thing that often happens in the service of denial, both in individual psychoanalytic sessions and in organizations and meetings of all kinds. In a paper on the Hamburg Congress, John Kafka writes, "I have seen in myself, in German and non-German colleagues, and despite the most serious efforts to deal with the Holocaust, an impatience, a wish to move away from the topic." There may also be something else at work, connected to finding oneself in what still amounts to an anti-Semitic society, or at least a society in which anti-Semitism has not been eradicated. It should be clear that no one is being accused of bad faith here. As is commonly the case, everyone seems to have worked towards the success of the Congress, both in terms of its smooth running and as an attempt to manage something of an encounter with the Nazi past. The meaning of meeting on German soil was certainly not ignored, yet it's equally clear that the overall feeling was of something missed, a chance not taken, a coming together that looked like an event, but was actually a ritual, which made it possible to claim that an important thing had happened as a way of contributing to a defensive process. The parallel is perhaps with the ambivalent patient, which may mean every patient, who turns up to psychoanalysis precisely in order to stay the same. That is, the mere act of turning up is mistaken for doing the work, or is even an excuse for not doing it. I'm going to analysis, so that's enough. I don't need to take any further responsibility. The psychoanalytic community certainly turned up in Hamburg, and it was clearly challenged by the exhibition, by the mayor, by the exposure of Germans and Jews to one another, by the reminders in the external situation. Yet little was grasped hold of, with the consequence that no resolution could be achieved, but the cancerous mistrust and disturbance of unacknowledged yet deeply felt emotions continued to fester. This is all to say that identification, which was the official theme of the Hamburg Congress, was indeed a very present issue, but it was managed in a way that dodged the central question, nominated afterwards by the analyst Janine Chasseguet-Smergel as, "What is one to do with a Nazi father?" In the light of this, it's perhaps no surprise to hear that the next attempt to face up to this history on German soil in the 2007 Berlin Congress also had its very difficult aspect. I won't labour the point here, but it's never less instructive to notice that the organisers of the Congress constructed a kind of container for the tension involved in the return to Berlin, and then systematically, if unconsciously, undermined it. I'm referring here to a group called Being in Berlin that was set up for anyone to go to who wanted to do so, explicitly as an opportunity for all who may wish to pause to reflect on their experience and to express personal thoughts and feelings. That's how it was announced. The agenda was thus clearly stated to find a container for reflecting about personal thoughts and feelings generated by the experience of being in Berlin. What happened, however, was not only that such reflection occurred, as one would expect, but also, and perhaps one would expect this too, that the institutional setting, the Congress itself, enacted something around the group that revealed its own powerful unconscious. That is, the setting both encouraged the articulation of feeling and at the same time, in a classic enactment of ambivalence, blocked its resolution. This all happened around the administrative arrangements for the group, which in a profession that takes very seriously the conditions under which it practices, the regularity of time and space in particular, is exactly where one might look for symptomatic behavior. Because psychoanalysis gives priority to the safety of the setting as a way of containing the flow of unconscious processes, these processes push precisely at the seams of the setting in order to make themselves felt. The key symptom of this kind was the difficulty the organizers, led by the Israeli analyst Shmuel Ehrlich, had in timetabling the group appropriately, as if it always slipped out of mind. Ehrlich writes, although the event had been discussed and formulated long in advance, it turned out that while the time slot was indeed the same every day, something we insisted on, the same space could not be. We would have to wander or relocate ourselves to a different room each day. These words, wander and relocate, are clearly not neutral, but are chosen to resonate with the impact of Nazism itself and with its effects on psychoanalysis. It is a new kind of diaspora, as Anna Freud famously commented in the 1930s. But even this enforced nomadism did not fully encompass the degree of institutional acting out that the Being in Berlin group produced, even before it had properly got going. Not being sure how many people would attend, the group conveners had accepted a relatively small room for the group. About 25 chairs were laid out, lecture style, facing the front, despite the organizers' request for a circle. And when people started to arrive, it rapidly became clear that the room would not be able to hold them all. What happened next, and one has to recall that these are psychoanalysts that one is reading about, what happened next is eerie in its recapitulative power. Here's the description the organizers give. The behavior was both frightening and troubling. While 60 or 70 people were quite uncomfortably squeezed into the room, there seemed to be twice as many outside the door trying to get in. A struggle developed between the people standing inside and those outside. There were feeble attempts by those standing in the doorway to explain that there was no more room, and the noise from the hall was quite disruptive to whatever was beginning to transpire inside. Finally, there was a decisive slamming shut of the door. Immediately, associations came up from the group of being squeezed into a cattle car and the doors being shut as in the gas chambers. End of the quote. For the second day, the Congress organizers arranged a larger space. However, rather than the container referred to in the announcement of the group, this turned out to be a non-existing fabricated room, a foyer space from which a number of doors led to other panels taking place at the same time. Doors which had to be closed, this is a quote, had to be closed and guarded by specially hired personnel to make sure there were no interruptions. Apparently for safety reasons, only 50 chairs were initially supplied. 250 people turned up. More chairs had to be gathered. People grabbed them, sometimes violently, and someone was hurt. And, to quote, the rapid, rhythmic, metallic sound of chairs being dislodged from the carriers was constantly in the background, and several people associated it to the sound of trains. It's one thing to recognize the impact of these disruptions to the frame of analysis, and another to be sure of their source. Ehrlich and his colleagues are in no doubt about the former, and seem to see the pain involved as having been in some ways conducive to their task. This is what they write. Attempting to provide a space for feelings and associations evoked images in the participants of the slamming shut of boxcar doors and the sound and sensation of trains, angry wishes for the conductor, the leader or Führer, to act more forcefully in order to establish order in the chaotic situation, aggressive shouts and objections directed at the Congress photographer who tried to take pictures, and so on. These were readily available associations and recapitulations. They testify to the poignancy and aliveness of the associations, symbolizations, and feelings about Nazi Germany and its atrocities. End of quote. This all rings true, but to my mind there's something else going on here as well. How could it be that the sophisticated psychoanalysts who set this up could not predict that there would be this powerful enactment, as well as the resurfacing of what the organizers are not afraid to name as anti-Semitism in some of the contributions to the group itself. Why have the Jews got all the sympathy? Why did my parents look after Jews and not me? That kind of thing. My own view is that there remains something lacking in the psychoanalytic heritage, which is a genuine coming to terms with the Jewish part of that heritage, a very large part, as we know, and with the immense injury done to it by the custodians of that heritage themselves. Can the present-day leaders really face up to it so that some kind of resolution in forgiveness can be managed? Or are we likely to see repeated enactments in place of a genuine working through? Something poisonous seems still to be alive, and psychoanalysis itself is not completely free of this. My third section is called On Shattering the Vessels. My excursus through a painful element in the history of psychoanalysis was, I want to repeat, not intended as an attack on the discipline, but as a lesson in starting at home before preaching to others. Again, using Jessica Benjamin's moral third framework, we need to find ways of acknowledging what happens, even in what might appear to be the most enlightened institutional settings. What can be more astute than psychoanalysis? A reflective practice that examines carefully and rigorously every element of its own behavior for signs of unconscious blocks and destructive impulses. Yet even in those circumstances, things go wrong. And we might ask whether there is something in the encounter with Jews and Jewishness that is both exciting and toxic, making the ground especially slippery, and not just for psychoanalysis. I want to move on to slightly safer, if more esoteric ground now. Is there something that psychoanalysis can derive from the Jewish encounter with forgiveness? That might sound an odd way round. Why not ask instead what Jews can gain from psychoanalysis's teachings on how to forgive? But I'm taking seriously here the idea that psychoanalysis draws on some Jewish perspectives and want to reintroduce what some of these might be in our particular area of interest today. Paramount here is a line of thought around what it might mean to recognize the reality of human destructiveness and to try to find ways of facing up to it that lead not to recrimination, but to reparation. A characteristic example is the claim, and this is a quote from an author called Lutsky, that there is a striking congruence between the Kabbalistic myth of tikkun, which I'll explain in a moment, and the Kleinian concept of reparation, both metaphors of creation, fragmentation, and recreation, of the mystical cosmos on the one hand, of the internal object world on the other. These two powerful ideas do indeed have many similarities, and both are set up as responses, individual and communal, to the operations of a destructive impulse that can be observed in human affairs. Reparation refers to the variety of, this is a quote from Melanie Klein, the variety of processes by which the ego feels it undoes harm done in fantasy, restores, preserves, and revives objects. Tikkun is the term given in the Kabbalah, the mystical system, to complex processes whereby the fragmentation of the universe produced at the start of creation is made good by the acts of humans, especially and particularly Jews, who repair the breach in reality and recover aspects of the divine from the shadowland into which they have fallen. Both these sets of images are responding to a very widely felt psychological sensation of guilt arising from a consciousness of destructiveness. Both of them also have historical resonance, inclined to the destructiveness of the first half of the 20th century, and in Lurianic mysticism, to the historical cataclysm of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain at the end of the 15th century and the deepening of the Jewish exile. How could such disasters come about? Each theory might be understood to ask. Because we are challenged, seems to be the answer. In the one case, to find sources within ourselves to enable us to overcome and make good our destructiveness. In the other, to formulate a way forward in relation to finding the divine light even in what seems to be utter darkness and repairing it. It seems likely that parallels such as these between some core psychoanalytic concepts and those to be found in the Jewish mystical tradition have some validity, but perhaps this is mostly because such concepts gain their potency and durability because they refer to widely shared dilemmas, in this case how to deal with guilt, loss, and the sense of unreasonable punishment. Whether this is a specific and meaningful link between psychoanalysis and Judaism is another matter. It's very probable that similar parallels can be found with many other traditions, as studies of Christianity, Buddhism, and so on all testify. Nevertheless, Jewish mysticism has its own profound dynamic, especially grappling with issues of exile and hester panim, God apparently wantonly turning his face away from those who need him. This suggests at least one route of connection between psychoanalysis with its Jewish heritage and Judaism or Jewish experience. It has sometimes been suggested that psychological suffering is a kind of exilic state, a separation from oneself. I'm not overly keen on this idea, as it implies that against such an exile there is a true state of identity that represents well-being and integrity, a kind of wholeness or home to which we might all aim to return. I see this as a kind of regressive fantasy, which is contradicted by the psychoanalytic revelation of how each of us, as the human subject, is split, and how our identities are multiple, fragmented, and conflictual. We are never fully at home with ourselves. This is a psychoanalytic notion, expressed in Freud's famous remark that psychoanalysis is a blow to narcissism, because it demonstrates that the ego is not even master in its own house. There is even a biblical link here. When Jacob, at the start of the Torah portion of Vayeshev, thinks to settle down in his old age, the text seems to be about to recount his achievements, but gets nowhere. All it says is, and this is from Genesis, these are the progeny of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. Any of you who know the story will know that that is the beginning of trouble, as you should also be aware of whenever anybody mentions a 17-year-old adolescent. Rashi's commentary is penetrating here. This is from Rashi, the 11th century commentator I mentioned before. Jacob wanted to live at ease, but this trouble in connection with Joseph suddenly came upon him. When the righteous wish to live at ease, the Holy One, blessed be He, says of them, "Are not the righteous satisfied with what's stored up for them in the world to come, that they wish to live at ease in this world too?" What can be seen at work in this passage is a strikingly psychoanalytic idea that we become settled only at the price of relinquishing our awareness of our deeply unsettled nature, the way a certain kind of trouble or disturbance is a condition of our being, of living in this world. We wander all the time, seeking somewhere to take rest, but knowing that this is not fully achievable. Diasporic consciousness in this regard is not an accident, but something intrinsic both to Jewish life and to psychoanalysis. Under such circumstances, we never reach a restful state in which destructiveness is completely averted. We never reach a restful state in which destructiveness is completely averted. Reparation, tikkun, and forgiveness are endlessly necessary. It's perhaps in this context that it's worth returning to the idea of reparation as a mode of forgiveness, a point again that Harvey touched on. This is a difficult set of arguments, so I will try to be clear at the risk of simplifying rather too much. In the Jewish mystical tradition, as described in an unsurpassed way by Gershom Scholem, the breaking of the 10 sephirot, or vessels, during creation is a catastrophe. They were meant to hold the divine light, and their loss scatters this light everywhere, producing an exile of the divine that forces history into motion as a process of suffering and searching until the scattered sparks can be redeemed. What this suggests is that at some point in time, usually referred to as the coming of the Messiah, there will be a gathering in of the exiles and a new era that is radically distinct from all that's gone before. At its simplest, the rent universe will be repaired, made whole again. I see this as a metaphor of forgiveness, The damage that we perpetrate is made good by the way in which we perform mitzvot, acts of reparation. But it is also possible to read the sparks differently, not as a kind of failure, but rather as a way of indicating that there are various forms of holiness in the world that need to be treasured for their own way of being. That is, we should find ways to acknowledge things that have been lost or abandoned and value them precisely in their exilic, diasporic state. This is why the contemporary social philosopher Judith Butler emphasizes the idea put forward by Walter Benjamin that the flashing up of the lights of the Sephirot should be understood to express the possibility that those who have lost most and who are written out of humanity have the chance to return to make their presence felt. This suggests that a precursor to forgiveness is justice, and even before that comes the requirement to remember, to ensure that what has been hidden from consciousness is not completely lost. My final section is called Social Forgiveness. In his theses on the philosophy of history, Walter Benjamin asserts the necessity of recognition of the past in the present. Without such recognition, the past disappears. He writes, "For every image of the past which is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns threatens to disappear irretrievably." The incitement to remembrance that Benjamin references directs us to continually re-examine the past, to keep it in the present as a living entity, not only as a memorial to something lost. What happened? What was done? What's the legacy? Especially, what injustice does it speak of that penetrates the present in barely visible streams of dust and smoke? The dust of historical oppression, the smoke and fumes of past destruction, these vapors drift across time and are breathed in by every generation, ghostly emanations that infiltrate the present, structuring it and giving it meaning, and sometimes poisoning it too. And the future? The future is only sustainable in the present as an openness, but this might mean that something has to be forsaken or forgiven. Something has to be let go of or overcome before we can learn to move on. I'm suggesting here that memory and forgiveness have to run together, and that this is part of the relationship between a kind of Jewish sensibility and the question of what sorts of conditions can give rise to forgiveness and what forgiveness can entail. I want now to finish with some material on this that I covered in my book, Hauntings. I apologize for this, in that those of you who have read the book will find this repetitious, and those who haven't will probably find it enigmatically sketchy. Still, I shall have a go here. The focus of the chapter in that book that I called Forgiveness is S. Ansky's play, The Dybbuk, written between 1916 and 1920, and the remarkable film made of it in 1937 in Poland by Michal Wosiński, the most famous and best Yiddish film of all time. In the book, I point to the haunted nature of the Dybbuk, which of course is about possession by a dead spirit, and especially of the haunting nature of the film. The world conjured by the film had already largely gone by the 1930s, but the faces and voices of the people in it were real enough, as many of them belonged to the actual inhabitants of the village of Kazimierz in Poland, most of whom died in the Nazi terror. The lead couple in the film survived, ironically and accidentally, when they missed their ship back to Poland from New York because of delays in making another Yiddish film. And many of the other professional actors also fled to America. But the dominant musical presence in the Dybbuk, the great cantor Gershon Sirota, was killed in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. Reading or watching the play, but particularly viewing the film, is thus itself an act of memory and resurrection, laced unbearably with the knowledge of what came next, haunted, that is, by the future more than by the past. What was to come is the temporality of viewing. The viewer's body is itself inhabited by the Dybbuk of those who we see before us on the screen, whose lives were cut short and perhaps have nowhere to go. Even in its form, then, the Dybbuk is a ghostly resurrection, something blowing back from before the Nazi Holocaust, It consequently embodies a kind of possession which is hard to lay to rest. However fervently the memorial prayer, the Kaddish, is recited, as it is at the end of the film. It's also a manifestation not only of the melancholic elements of destroyed cultures, returning again and again to trouble and distress the present, but of the call to restitution, and possibly, though sometimes at extreme cost, to forgiveness. The story of the Dybbuk can be stated briefly, though this does it an injustice. Two men promise that their unborn babies will marry one another as a way to seal their own mutual devotion. When it comes to it, fate and human blindness block the marriage, and the erstwhile groom dies. He returns to possess his bride as a Dybbuk. Indeed, in a deviation from the conventional Dybbuk story, he is welcomed by her. After a painful and dramatic trial and then exorcism by the miracle-working Rebbe, the Dybbuk leaves the girl's body, but she wills herself to die in order to be reunited with him in death. The conventional formula on discovering a death, "Blessed be the true judge," is the final phrase of the play and the film. My suggestion is that the Dybbuk recognizes how a society can desert its own promises. Or maybe one should think of it as showing how all social orders, all symbolic structures, are full of rifts and incompleteness. And what the Dybbuk dramatizes is how painful it is when one comes face to face with these. The lovers strive to heal this rift by fulfilling a pledge that has not been kept. They thereby affirm the well-being of the symbolic, its phallic potency, just when the impossible dilemmas of that potency are visible to all, when it has betrayed them. Repairing the damage done by this betrayal is impossible. It would involve a wedding between a dead groom and a living bride. It cannot be done without violence. The Rebbe tries to deal with this by casting out the intrusive Dybbuk, but this does not work. And what we are then exposed to is a haunting by something that cannot be contained within the usual parameters of the symbolic order. Put more bleakly, the Dybbuk is a demonstration of how desperately we strive to maintain the appearance of symbolic order when experience demonstrates time and again that this order is teetering on the edge of collapse. And this is not fiction. Whilst the story of the lovers is an invented one, possible only because ghostly things can be made to happen in the theatre and on film, the Dybbuk is a very material spirit, an actual visitation from beyond the grave. It not only brings to life what once existed, it also fills out the present with the beings of those who have gone before their time. The film is a restless piece that holds the future responsible for what was to come. It demands that those who have broken their promise are held to account, but it also conjures up a melancholic consciousness in which what has been lost and hidden is brought into awareness, precisely so that, whatever the consequences, it can be mourned. This too is a mode of forgiveness. But there is also something else. In her meditation on social violence, Judith Butler draws upon the psychoanalytic, specifically Kleinian idea that our capacity to be ethical subjects is measured by our ability to make good the damage we do. She identifies this as a certain ethical practice that seeks to preserve life better than it destroys it. I take the phrase, to preserve life better than it destroys it, as a vital one both for Judaism and for psychoanalysis. Every one of us has injuriousness within us and is tempted to express that in relation to others, with whom we have contact and on whom we are likely to be dependent. Recognition of this tendency to violence, this temptation to destroy everything, leads to recognition of the responsibility we have to struggle against the temptation and to acknowledge what we have done when the struggle fails. This leads me to my final example, which comes from one of the philosopher Emanuel Levinas's Talmudic readings, which is called The Temptation of Temptation. The Temptation of Temptation deals with an especially provocative moment in the Talmud, where the rabbis are debating the line from Exodus reading, "And they stopped at the foot of the mountain." This refers to the moment of the revelation at Mount Sinai. The Israelites are encamped there, awaiting the word of God. The people declare their willingness to hear and obey the Torah law before they know exactly what will be in it, an act of apparent free choice. But how free were they really? The Talmud is not too sure. Here's the quote from the Talmud. Rav Abdima Bahama Bahasa has said, "This teaches us that the Holy One, blessed be He, inclined the mountain over them like a tilted tub, and that He said, 'If you accept the Torah, all is well. If not, here will be your grave.' Rav Aha Bar Yaakov said, that is a great warning concerning the Torah. Resh Lakish taught, what does the verse mean, every evening came, then morning, it was the sixth day? The definite article is not necessary. Answer, God had established a covenant with the works of the beginning. If Israel accepts the Torah, you will continue to exist. If not, I will bring you back to chaos." So much for free choice. Levinas proceeds with his analysis of this passage and the section that follows in a suitably Talmudic way by commenting on the text line by line. It's not possible to follow this in detail here, but I want to pull one element out from his discussion. The issue of the draw towards violence. The mountain hovered over the people, threatening to crush them. They were literally beneath the mountain. Levinas notes that, to quote, "the choice of the Jewish way of being, of the difficult freedom of being Jewish, would have been a choice between this way and death. In the beginning was violence." End of quote. The first choice is a forced one, from which no one can step back, because if they do, they cease to be human. They cease to stand in any kind of ethical relationship with themselves or with others. This is clearly a challenging reading, as it suggests that the absence of choice in the acceptance of the frame of the Torah instantiates violence at the heart of religious and moral action. It is this relationship between freedom and violence that's the focus of the next section, ending with, "If Israel accepts the Torah, you will continue to exist. If not, I will bring you back to chaos." This is how Levinas reads the apparent lack of free choice embedded in the threat, existence, or chaos. It's my last quote, slightly long. This is Levinas. "The mountain turned upside down like a tub above the Israelites, thus threatened the universe. God, therefore, did not create without concerning himself with the meaning of creation. Being has a meaning. The meaning of being, the meaning of creation, is to realize the Torah. The world is here so that the ethical order has the possibility of being fulfilled. The act by which the Israelites accept the Torah is the act which gives meaning to reality. To refuse the Torah is to bring being back to nothingness. The unfortunate universe also had to accept its subordination to the ethical order, and Mount Sinai was for it the moment in which its to be or not to be was being decided. The refusal of the Israelites would have been the signal for the annihilation of the entire universe." End of quote. The mountain hovers over all of us. Thinking about it as a tub does not quite capture the degree of threat involved. We are not being offered a bath in a gentle container. We are being offered the choice between existence and chaos. Being has a meaning, Levinas asserts. This meaning is that of an ethical responsibility towards others that founds the human as a subject. The world is here so that the ethical order has the possibility of being fulfilled. Without this ethical framing, there is nothing. When it fails, there's no rest. There is only constant suffering between two worlds, as Ansky puts it. The psychology and philosophy of this are powerful enough, but the politics of it are also pronounced. Speaking mythologically and metaphorically, as perhaps one must when dealing with claims of such grandiosity, the survival of humanity depends on the construction of social orders that accept an ethical frame that does justice to the needs of others, finding space for everyone to be recognized as full subjects. This also requires recognition of the violence that lies at the edges of the social order, and therefore of the protective movement of acknowledgement and reparation required to keep the further visitation of that violence at bay. This is not a matter of free choice, but it is a choice. It just happens, however, that the choice is between existence and chaos. If you accept, all is well. If not, here will be your grave. There is plenty of evidence that this is a real choice. We often go for chaos and the grave. It's still an open question whether we are capable of making the other choice, the one with its roots in forgiveness. But both psychoanalysis and Judaism insist that we try. Thank you. Apparently I'm my own chair, so I will be delighted to enter into conversation with anybody who has anything they'd like to say. There's a lady over there.
Right, so if you have any questions, I'm going to ask that you line up and speak into this microphone here. We need that so that we can hear in the room, but also so that we can record it on the video so that we can hear your question. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you for a very, very insightful and compelling lecture. I'm a clinician, and it struck me. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm a clinician, and it struck me that you didn't mention family of origin as a source of injustice, and the patient having to take hold of the concept of forgiveness when the family of origin is unjust, sometimes to an extreme, as well as the issue of reparations and the patient's expectation that there should be, and most frequently there is not. And the patient also has to come to terms with the same issue, manifested by working through that anger, disappointment, and grief. And I was surprised it wasn't mentioned, because of all the institutions, probably the family of origin is the source of most reenactments. So that's my question.
Let me just check. Should I try and respond to each one, do you think, Harvey? Or okay, good. Well, thank you. First of all, you're completely right. It's an absence in this particular talk. And you're also right, of course, in what you say about the way in which the family of origin can be, as you put it, a source of injustice, for which patients often seek and don't necessarily find reparation. It's very hard to know exactly how to respond to that. I worked for a long time as a family therapist, so I'm very much appreciative of you highlighting that as an absence here. And I also worked for some time with children who'd been sexually abused, and most of that was within family context. So again, it's certainly the case that families, just as they are the space for the haven in the heart, as people classically describe it, are also the most dangerous places for children to be at times. So that's one thing to say, that I acknowledge the strength of your point about the necessity in a comprehensive kind of argument about forgiveness in relation to psychoanalysis to think about families of origin. I'm not sure what more to say about it than that at the moment. I think the idea that each one of us has to learn to forgive our parents for their failures is quite a deeply rooted psychoanalytic idea. And it's not necessarily linked with the reality of family life, the actual experiences somebody has had. It's a kind of statement one makes about pretty well every family. It's got some elements, of course, of Oedipal material in it. And the other way around, it's certainly got ideas in it about the envy that the older generation feels for the young, and so how the younger generation have to forgive them that. But the bigger thing, I think, is something about how in each generation we have to learn to maintain a relationship with our parents as real, less idealized, and hence always failing creatures. You'll know very well, I think, from the way you frame that, Winnicott's fundamental ideas about good enough, he calls it mothering, let's call it parenting, good enough parenting, being based on a kind of failure. The good enough parent is not the perfect parent who's always there for the child's needs. The good enough parent finds a way to lose attention, to turn away from the child. They just do it in a kind of graduated way within a framework of care and holding, so that the child has a sense of security and a capacity to feel that even when they're alone, their parents have abandoned them. They are in someone's presence. And I think that's quite a profound idea, actually, that extends to the everyday practice of psychoanalysis as well. A sort of an appreciation of how even in the most calm family context, something must go wrong. And at that moment, you're faced with the difference between, I suppose you're faced with the difference between Narcissus and Oedipus, between or what the Lacanians would call the imaginary and the symbolic. That is, you're faced with the reality that what you want to be a perfect world can never be like that. Those of you who are involved know more about your Jewish life will also know that there's a phrase that we say in the psalm that we say throughout the month of Elul, and then up until Shmini Atzeres, so the period of the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and so on. There's a wonderful psalm we say which includes in it the phrase, "My mother and my father have abandoned me." And we all say it, whether or not, everybody who says that psalm says it, whether or not one's mother and father have really abandoned us. It's an awareness that that state of abandonment must always come about in some way. It's the best I can do in relation to your question on the spot.
Thank you for your explanation of what went on in Berlin and Hamburg. I appreciated that. Also, it happens I visit Germany every couple of years. I visit relatives there. And the quote you just made about the prayer, it's something that always seems silly to me. But from the prayer we say during Elul about my mother and father, it never made sense to me until after my parents died. I have thought sometimes about the life of Isaac and what he may or may have not experienced. And there's lots of room for projection because very little is really told to us. And I wonder if you have any speculation on that.
The life of Isaac, the biblical patriarch, father of that Jacob who had the, troublesome son, Joseph. Well, a couple of things. There are various people who think that Isaac might have had a learning disability because he's so passive. But leaving that aside, I don't really want to do a long thing. I could talk a lot because I think a lot about this myself. The key moment in Isaac's life is, of course, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, in which his father Abraham takes him up to the mountain and nearly kills him. And there's a few things to note about this. What must this have been like? For what we are told by Rashi was not a young child, but a 37-year-old man who allows himself to be taken up to the top of a mountain, is tied to a pyre and nearly killed by his father who loves him. What does all this mean? There's a couple of beautiful things in Midrash about that. One is that makes sense of Isaac's later blindness. Isaac's blindness is very important for the story of Jacob later. Why is Isaac blind? Because as he's lying on the pyre and he looks up, so the gates of heaven open and the angels are crying and their tears drop into his eyes and they blind him. And Isaac is therefore made blind by a kind of pity that's directed at him, a sort of overpowering emotion which recognizes the situation for what it is. It's something unbearably intense, passionate, poignant, and also kind of unforgivable as well. How can this be allowed to happen? And then it's not allowed to happen. But the moment, that's one thing. Second thing about Isaac is, again in the Midrash, there's a debate about whether he was actually killed or not. There's various reasons why this is a subjugated narrative, which have to do with the Christian story of Jesus and resurrection. So the Jewish rabbis didn't want there to be the exact parallel in the Jewish story. It was a bit problematic for them. But it is quite a strong, the reason for this is that it says Abraham and his son went up together, but it only says Abraham came down from the mountain. So the question is, what happened to Isaac? And one of the accounts given, quite a powerful account, is Isaac was sacrificed, and he spent 3 years in heaven having his wounds fixed. And then he came down from heaven. That's why he's not at his mother's funeral, by the way. He's not at his mother's funeral. He's in heaven having his wounds dealt with. And when he comes down, it's to meet his new bride, Rebecca, which is why she falls off her camel when she sees him, because when you come down from heaven, from paradise, you walk like the dead walk, with your head on the ground and your feet in the air. And she sees this husband of hers walking with his head on the ground and his feet in the air, coming down from heaven, and she falls off her camel in astonishment. What I really think about this is that the story itself has many complexities, of course it does, and Isaac is a fascinating figure in his very passivity. But what we see about him is a kind of blindness of spirit that creates problems. I mean, it's hard to put this briefly, but I think it probably just, I don't know what it's left there to teach us, if it's there to teach us. What we can learn from it, maybe, is better. I think the resonance of it is in this kind of question about what it means to be a blind person seeking truth. Best I can do, but you got midrash, not psychoanalysis there. Sorry, I think I meant to do more psychoanalysis than midrash.
My father-in-law was a Holocaust survivor, and I learned from him and others that the term survivor guilt that we talk about is not just about having survived while others died. It's about what the survivors had to do in order to survive. Sometimes to other Jews. And this is not their fault. This is the structure of the situation. So my question is about forgiveness within the Jewish people and within our, maybe less so individually, how do we forgive ourselves? But I'm interested in the internalized anti-Semitism and how it holds us. Big one, eh?
Just a little bit big. And also, in a way, I think two questions in one. One is about the issue of kind of forgiveness within the Jewish people, and the other one, I think it's different, the internalized anti-Semitism. I think it's slightly different. Because you could say that well-worked issue, I mean, it's a big issue, as you say, about, how come, what happened, how did these Jews do this to other Jews, all that kind of thing, is a genuine ethical question. It doesn't necessarily relate to anti-Semitism as such, I think. It does actually, I can see that it does as well. Goodness, I don't know if I'll be able to answer this properly. So just to comment on a few elements of it. Firstly, this question of what it means to have survived is a very big one. To have survived at all. It's been written about a great deal in the trauma literature that I know some people here are aware of and indeed working on. What in a way, it's like, psychoanalysts say this about people who try and commit suicide, that they recover but they've still succeeded in some way. And it's a bit like that with this idea of survival, that yes, people have survived and they may well be very resolute and extraordinarily impressive, as many people have been. But is there something that's been left behind? There's a really remarkable but extremely controversial book by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, some of you may know. It's called Remnants of Auschwitz. He talks about the idea of the Musselman. Musselmänner are those who are on the point of death in the camps. Those who seem to have no longer any consciousness of themselves as people. And he says these people are the only ones who could testify as witnesses to what the reality of the camp was. But they're precisely the people that can't testify because they didn't survive. And then, really oddly in this book, he has an appendix in which he has testimonies from Musselmänner. That is, he contradicts his own thesis, I think quite deliberately, as a way of trying to think through this tension, by saying there are people who have survived who were not people even then, and yet they've come through it differently. So what am I saying? I think I'll just give you a practical example rather than be able to do a very proper, cogent response to you. And then I'll just very quickly say something about internalized anti-Semitism. And forgive me, I think I was talking about this on Friday night, I can't remember now, in our small dinner. In Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah, which many of you will know and have seen, many of you will also, no doubt, remember the passage with Abraham Bomba. Abraham Bomba was a barber in Auschwitz. His job was to cut the hair of the women in the gas chambers. For about 10 days, they were actually in the gas chambers. Later on, the system was changed. He and the other barbers were in the gas chambers, cutting the hair of these women, and then they left and the women were gassed. And Lanzmann needs his testimony for his film because he wants to establish in his film the absolute concrete reality of what happened during the Shoah, the absolute mechanics of it, so that nobody can deny it. So he's got this guy who was literally in the gas chamber. It's the nearest you could get to getting, an account from somebody who was killed in the gas chamber. And what he does with Bomba, he sets up a fake barber shop. So in this whole period of this film, Bomba is cutting actually a man's hair in this barber shop. Turns out, you don't know this in the film, it turns out this barber shop, and you don't know it's fake, it's a setup. It's in Israel, that's clear even in the film, and it's also manned by barbers and by customers who are Mizrahim. They're from the Oriental Sephardi Arabic, Iraqi particularly, Israeli part of the Israeli population. They don't speak English. And the testimony is going on in English. So it's deliberately set up that they won't know what's happening and so on. It's an extraordinary piece, and it comes to a moment where Bomba is describing how a friend of his comes face to face with his wife and his sister, has to cut their hair, is faced with the moment of deciding what to tell them, if anything. At that moment, Bomba, who's been declaiming in a somewhat cut-off way, declaiming his story, stops, and he can't go on. And he says, I can't go on. I told you it would be difficult. I told you it would be too difficult. I can't go on. And Lanzmann says to him, you have to. We have to. I apologize. But you know we have to do it. And Bomba says again, I can't go on. And this is repeated. And then you see Bomba wiping his eyes, walking away from the camera, which is following him the whole time. A lot of the filming is done through the mirrors in the barber shop, so there's no escape for this witness. And eventually comes back and he tells the story. And there's a big literature, actually, about the ethics of this moment in the film. Because it's clearly not therapeutic. It's not set up to be therapeutic. It's not about making Bomba feel better. If anything, he feels worse. It's set up only for Lanzmann and his film. He feels his film is really important as a mode of testimony itself. It is a witnessing act. And he needs this survivor to speak about what it means to have literally been there and done this thing. How he felt, where he says he couldn't feel anything. It's the moment actually he says he couldn't feel anything that he begins to cry. Again, very interestingly, if you think about it psychodynamically. What am I saying about this? I think that this issue about what it means to survive, what it means to give testimony, what it means to be a witness to that testimony as well, who can listen to it, what role you take when you're listening to it, is so complicated that I'm not sure we can even say, who is a survivor and who's not. And I certainly don't see us, certainly myself, and I don't know who would be in a position to be able to judge the actual situation of those people who found themselves having to compromise, having to do things under duress for the Nazis at the time. Internalized anti-Semitism, very, very complicated issue. You'll know perhaps the Israeli author Aaron Appelfeld, a marvelous writer, wrote a book called Story of a Life, which is his memoir. And it's a remarkable book, to my mind even better than his very famous novels. I do really recommend it. He writes about coming to Israel, coming to Israel, and I think it was 1947, just before the state. Having wandered, he had lived as a 10-year-old boy, he'd been in the forests and stuff, taken in by people and so on, wandered across Europe after the war, as many refugees did. I imagine people here know, but it was a revelation to me to discover that displaced persons camps and people wandering across Europe went on for 7 or 8 years, went on to 1954 actually. He was wandering for a couple of years in children's groups and ended up in Palestine, where he was not allowed to speak his mother tongues. His mother tongue was German. His other mother, that was literally his mother's tongue. His fullest language was Yiddish, but he was forced to only speak Hebrew, which he regarded as the language of kind of yelling. He heard it as a sharp language of instruction, not a subtle language of temperate thought. It was only when he started to read classical Hebrew in the Bible that he became sensitive to the nuances of Hebrew and became one of the greatest of the Hebrew language authors. So it's also an interesting transition. But the point about that is there was a kind of denial of the reality of what people had gone through there, which was clearly linked, as you know, and people know this, it's only changed with the Eichmann trial in Israel. It was linked with the sense that these Jews had done something wrong. There was something wrong about them. I mean, Herzl was clearly anti-Semitic in many ways. Before Herzl set up the Zionist Federation, he had a plan to convert the Jews to Catholicism. All of them, because the idea was to normalize the Jews. The problem with the Jews was that he was right, we're all neurotic. And why are we neurotic? Well, because we have all this, we live an abnormal life. We don't have a land, that's why Zionism is relevant, so we're not rooted in something, and we don't have a society in which we belong. And that was, of course, a major point in Herzl thinking about why Zionism came about. A land for the Jews was a way of normalizing the Jews as a response to anti-Semitism, but it was built on an idea that there was something wrong with the Jews. Only having one's own land, one's own state, one's own place of rootedness would cure the Jews of what was wrong, their pathology, as well as normalizing us in the light of other people. So, I mean, in that sense, Jewish anti-Semitism, I want to put it really crudely, has got a long and very respectable history. Okay, I think that's probably what I can do. I mean, it's kind of thoughts in relation, I'm sorry, I can take refuge in this being a kind of psychoanalytic frame and say these are free associations in relation to your talk rather than a coherent argument. But I think, sorry, just to summarize, I don't want to go too long because another question. I think what I'm saying is, firstly, I don't know who is a survivor, what it means to be a survivor, because for all survivors it's going to be different. Secondly, this issue about complicity is not one for us to judge. I really feel that strongly. Thirdly, this history of in Jewish anti-Semitism, internalized anti-Semitism, I guess it's real, but it's also long-standing, and it's that kind of question about what we take in from outside and what resilience we have within ourselves. Sorry, that was long and convoluted. What? Yeah?
I had a very brief thought. I very much like the medrash that you quote of the Jews under the mountain, sometimes under the mountain. But there's a simpler choice offered that I think also brings together the notion of the messianic, the notion of reparation, psychoanalysis, and all of that at the very end of Torah. At the very end of Tanakh, the last lines of Malachi, of Malachi, are, and you'll excuse my translation, but behold, I'm sending to you Elijah before the great and awesome day of God, or before the day of God, the awesome, it's hard to translate. And he defines his task. And his task is a very elegant and simple one and leads to a choice. His task is of a Heshiv Lev Avos Albanim. He has to return the hearts of the parents onto the children. I'm thinking of this first question, and I'm thinking of the Oedipal at the same time. V'lev Banim Alavosam, and the hearts of the children onto their parents. And it ends, and if not, I will thoroughly destroy you. Yeah. I actually like that choice.
Thank you. I mean, I think that adds to the answer to the original question. I don't have a response, but thank you. Close? Thank you very much. Thank you.